Make sure to check out the previous video in this series, link in the description. Do you think she blames herself? I don't know, man. Probably. I stretched out on the reclined seat of my Chevy and pulled the bill of my hat down over my eyes. But do you think she's okay? I didn't answer him. I certainly hadn't been okay when Whitney died, and Kimber was even closer to her mum than I was with my sister. She was definitely not okay. Sam, seriously, I'm fucking freaking out here. It's been 2 days. I pushed my hat up off my face and looked over at Kyle, who was, admittedly, a wreck. His eyes were bloodshot, his face sallow, and his red hair was greasy. Dude, her mum committed suicide. You know how close Kimber was to her mum. She just needs some time. She'll be okay. She hasn't answered any of my texts or calls. I've left like 9 voicemails. Man, I think I'm going crazy. You just have to give her some space. Yeah, but she's my... He still couldn't say it out loud around me. I'm supposed to take care of her. I sat up and pulled the chair up right behind me. Look, Kyle, I know you want to help Kimber, and I want to help Kimber too, but she hasn't answered our calls, been to school, or come to the door when we've stopped by her house. She doesn't want to see us right now, and we have to be okay with that. Right now, Kimber knows what's best for Kimber. What about the suicide note then? You think that has something to do with it? I sighed. We don't even know if there was a suicide note. Kimber's dad was upset and messed up when he said that, and it's possible I misheard him anyway. I asked my dad and he said that there was no letter. Yeah, right, because your dad is an absolute upstanding arbiter of truth. One look, and Kyle instantly regretted his words. I shrugged. I don't know what to believe anymore, honestly. The truth was that I knew what I heard. Mr. DeStaro had said something to the cops about a letter, but I couldn't tell Kyle that. Not right now. He was already worried that his relationship with Kimber was part of the reason her mother had been depressed. I'd asked my dad about the letter when he'd come home after the long night, and he sighed, ran both of his hands through his hair in a tired way, and said, Sam, I don't know what to tell you. And DeStaro didn't have a suicide note, and this is the first I've heard of it. With our best friend in mourning and our investigation on hold, Kyle and I had been existing in a sort of suspended state. We went to school intermittently, skipping classes here and there, missing end-of-year tests and smoking more weed than either of us could afford. Without Kimber there to set us straight and keep us in line, we were lethargic, brooding, and irresponsible. I'd never realized just how much I depended on her. Kyle and I skipped on the last 2 periods of the day and debated on whether we should even go to school tomorrow, which was the last day of sophomore year. We have finally decided to show up for 2nd period, which I was glad we did, because Kimber showed up in biology. I didn't even see her at first. I had my head down on my desk, resting on folded arms, when I felt a meek hand pat my shoulder. I turned around to see her, standing there, looking unsure and uncomfortable. I gave her half a smile and pulled her into a hug. But this wasn't one of those super comforting, not at all awkward Kimber hugs. It was a longer, weaker hug. And I felt so protective in it that I was sad when it was over. "Hey, how are you doing, Kay?" I asked her when she finally released me. Kimber wiped a tear off her cheek. "I'm okay." And she gave me a wobbly smile, and I knew it wasn't true. I wrapped her into another quick hug as Phoebe Dranger gave us a snotty look. "Have you seen Kyle yet?" "No, I have next period with him. He's been worried sick about you." "I know, Sam," she said, averting her eyes to the floor. "Things have been really hard for me at home." "It's okay," I said. "We're here for you, whatever you need." Yeah, that's what I was hoping. "Hey, whatever you need." Since it was the last day of school, our teacher, Mr. Founder, was just happy to return our graded tests and let us bullshit the rest of the period. Kimber talked about the arrangements for the funeral that weekend and chided Kyle and I for skipping finals to go get stoned. When the bell rang, I could see that Kimber was both excited and nervous to see Kyle. As we packed up our bags, I assured her that Kyle wasn't mad. He was just worried about her. She threw a bag over her shoulder, set her jaw, and nodded. She was trying so hard to keep it together. As soon as Kyle saw her from down the hall, he slammed his locker shut and walked towards us with such an intensity, I began to wonder if maybe he was actually mad. He pushed past a dozen people without so much as glancing at them and left a curious, if not annoyed, crowd in his wake. When he finally reached us, he threw his backpack against the wall and swooped Kimber up in the sort of way you'd see in an old black and white movie. Everyone who saw this unfold, including me, groaned in unison. Since most of the teachers weren't even bothering to take attendance that day, I went to calculus with Kimber and Kyle, where they had the same conversation that Kimber and I had the last period. Towards the end of the hour, the conversation faltered and became uneasy. Kyle and I exchanged a look over the top of Kimber's head, and I nodded at him. "Kimber," he said quietly, Did your mum leave a note?" "What?" Kimber asked in surprise. "I heard your dad talking about a letter the day... On Tuesday," I said. "Oh." As we waited for her to continue, the bell rang for lunch. Everyone filed out of the room, but the three of us stayed, still sitting at our desks. "Kimber," I finally said. She sighed sadly and looked over at Kyle. "Yeah." "What did it say?" he asked nervously. "I don't know. I haven't seen it. I asked my dad for it when we got home and he said I'd misheard him and that there was no letter. He said not to mention it to anyone else or I'd just upset people." "Well, then we both misheard him," I said, which seems a bit unlikely. I've known my dad all my life, and I know when he's lying. People started to file in for the next period, sliding sympathetic glances at Kimber. Since it was our lunch period, we gathered up our things and walked out to my car, as we always did. I sat in the back seat, letting Kyle and Kimber take the front. Kimber took a deep breath and continued. know my dad is lying. And I know he has the letter. Are you sure? Kyle asked. I could tell that he was still terrified that there was some blame that rested on him. Yeah. And I know it contains the name Prescott. I think I even know where it is. Prescott? Yet, somehow, I wasn't that surprised. He was the axis around which everything that was bad orbited. How do you know it says Prescott? Kyle asked. I heard my dad reading it once. I think he reads it a lot, actually. He was sort of sobbing and whispering the words and throwing things in his office. My dad hasn't been well. Do you think maybe she was having an affair with Jimmy Prescott? I shook my head. I'm guessing you need to think a little bigger than that, Kyle. Kimber said, her hands in her lap. With everything we know about the Prescotts, I'm fairly sure this isn't about an affair. It's all connected somehow. I mean, don't you think? My dad was the love of my mum's life, but she only left a letter for me. I think that somehow I'm the one she wronged, not him. You know, I think she did something to me. Or maybe she did it because of me. Kimber's voice broke over the last sentence. Kyle pulled her over, kissed her on the top of the head, and whispered words into her ear that I couldn't quite hear. Alright, so we need to get the letter then, I said after giving them a minute. Yeah, I really need to read it. Kimber's voice was still wobbly. How do we get it then? I asked. I mean, if it's in the office, we just have to wait until he leaves home, Kyle said as he looked out the window. You don't think I thought of that, Kyle? Kimber sighed. He never leaves the office now. Not since we got home from the hospital. He even sleeps in there. So we need to get him out then? No. We need to get me in. Tomorrow is my mum's funeral, and half of Driskin will be there, including my dad, of course. I need to leave without him noticing and run home so I can go through the office. Okay, that's easy, I said, without my dad noticing. And I need to be back by the end of the service. We both nodded, but stayed silent because it looked like Kimber was weighing saying more. My dad, he's been very cold. I think he blames me. Kimber finally said. Oh, that's bullshit, Kyle spat. Can you guys help me? Absolutely. Of course. We spent the rest of that lunch period creating a plan far more strategic than the mission probably needed. Kyle and I would engage Mr. DeStaro in conversation, and then Kyle would get a text from Kimber telling him that she was having a mental breakdown in the bathroom. Kyle would leave to go comfort her, and they would take my car to the DeStaro home. I would stay behind and keep an eye on Kimber's dad while they were gone and going through his office. I went to work that afternoon for the first time since Monday. Mira seemed to be in a much better mood and let me go home early since it was a Friday. I didn't sleep well though. And I got up at 4 a.m. to go through my clothes, looking for something dressy to wear to the funeral. Whitney never got a funeral. I still wish that my dad came in before he left for work and found his disheveled, panicked teenage son looking helplessly through piles of black clothing. He smiled, pityingly, and led me to his own closet, since my dad and I had not only the same face, but the same build as well. So, finding something suitable to wear was easy. I thanked him, and he asked me to apologize to Kimber for having to work through the service, and that he sends his love. Andastaro's funeral was at Episcopalian church on the other side of town. I picked Kyle up at 9 and saw he was also wearing a suit of his dad's, though he didn't fit it nearly as well, and he was constantly pulling at the sleeves and readjusting the waistline. Unfortunately for Kyle, he was much, much smaller than his dad. We parked as far away from the church as possible, where we hoped no one would notice a car leaving. When we got inside the church, we saw that Kimber wouldn't have to do much acting to convince people she was having a breakdown. We found her at the back of the room, tucked into a chair, and in a puddle of curly orange hair and tears. Kyle sat down next to her and pulled her into a hug. Jesus, Kimber, what's wrong? I kicked his foot and shot him a look that said, "Dude, really?" Kyle bit his lip. Fuck. There's no one here, Kimber whispered against his chest. My mum grew up here. She had hundreds of friends in this town, and no one came. We looked around, and I had to admit the turnout was sparse. A few groups of 3 or 4 people standing together. Kimber's dad, who sat in a chair opposite the room of his daughter, with his head in his hands, and some family I recognised from barbecues at Kimber's house. Ex-Sheriff Cleary, with his wife Grace, was there, standing with a few of my dad's deputies and talking quietly in the corner. I could see why Kimber was upset. As we waited for the service to start, I was reminded that I'd never been to a funeral before. I still wished that we'd had one for my sister. But I knew we never could, since Whitney was still legally alive. It made me sad to think that she would never be laid to rest. Only a few other funeral goers trickled in, and the pastor began getting people seated for the service. I noticed the casket at the pulpit for the first time, and was glad it was closed. But still, I had to wonder at the simple, unadorned, almost ugly coffin that had been chosen for Kimber's mother. I knew the Destaros had money, quite a bit of it actually. So it was an interesting, almost insulting choice. Shit, poor Kimber. Kyle and I stood Kimber up and started over to the pews, but then she stopped abruptly. "I'm ready," she said, and brushed her hair away from her wet face. Ready to leave. I can't be in here anymore. It's a fucking disgrace to my mother. Kimber raised her head a notch and set her jaw. I knew this look, and it meant there would be no reasoning with her. Carl and I looked at each other. This wasn't the plan. It'd be a lot more obvious if Kimber was missing from the service, especially with the low turnout. You guys go over and say what we rehearsed to my dad. Kyle, I will text you in 30 seconds. Go. Kyle nodded and started over, and I knew we weren't arguing. Mr. DeStaro was finally standing, looking over at the front pew reserved for him and his daughter, with hesitation. Mr. DeStaro? I said as we approached. I'm very sorry to hear about your wife. She was, shit. I've forgotten my lines. A great woman who raised a wonderful daughter. Kyle finished. Yeah? He spat. The great women commit suicide, leaving their wonderful daughters alone in the world. Shit. The great women jump off buildings and make spectacles of themselves and leave their families to deal with the publicity and the grief. Kyle's phone chirped. Oh, thank God. Oh, that's Kimber, he said a little too fast before he had time to actually look at his phone. Oh man, she isn't well. Says she's crying and feeling sick. I'm gonna go help her. No! Mr. DeStaro yelled so suddenly that Kyle dropped the phone on the ground, where it made a loud clatter on the stone floor. Not you! You don't help my daughter. You don't even fucking talk to her. He can go. And of course, he pointed at me. Okay. I stuttered. The plan had changed too much. I needed to somehow get the car keys from Kyle without being seen. Kyle gave me a shaky, subtle nod, and then he and Mr. DeStaro went to sit down. It was obvious Kimber's dad was keeping a close eye on Kyle. Getting the keys from him was going to be impossible. I slunk into the shadows at the back of the room while the pastor started the service. I texted Kyle 4 times, begging for his help, but he wouldn't dare touch his phone. He just sat straight and looked ahead, flicking worried glances at Mr. DeStaro every few seconds. After several minutes, I went to find Kimber to see what she wanted to do, but she wasn't in our meeting spot by the back door. God, the plan was falling apart. I pulled out my phone and sent her a text. Where are you? Kyle is next to your dad and I can't get the keys from him. I waited in the hallway, tapping my phone against my hand nervously. After a minute or two, my phone vibrated. I'm sorry, I left without you guys. I had to get out of there. I'm so sorry. I'll be back before the end of the service. I promise. Shit. Be safe. It was now imperative that I not be seen. I went to the men's bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and played Snake for the longest 20 minutes of my life. I knew the service wouldn't go on much longer, so I texted Kimber again. You on your way back yet? Did you find it? I sat, waiting, watching the minutes tick by. I texted her again. I think the service is ending soon. Where are you? After another 7 minutes of no response, I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again, and the same result. I was getting nervous. I was about to try a third time when 2 people walked into the bathroom and my phone vibrated with the text. It was Kyle. The service was over. He said, Kimber has the keys. Why aren't you guys back yet? Did you find anything? I left the bathroom without washing my hands and received dirty looks from the 2 strangers at the urinals. I found Kyle standing outside the window, looking for my car. Kyle. He jumped. Where's Kimber? What did you guys find? I don't know. She left without me. What the fuck? Why? Where is she? Look, calm down. I don't know, Kyle. She left without me. I reiterated. She's not answering my calls or my texts. Oh, fuck, mine either. We have to keep an eye on her dad until she gets back. We're not the only ones, Kyle said, gesturing across the room. What the fuck is going on? 3 men were talking to Kimber's dad in a corner across the room. Chief among them was Killian Cleary, who was flanked by his 2 former deputies. Driskin's retired sheriff had his hand on Mr. DeStaro's arm and was speaking to him in an angry, hushed tone. Kimber's dad was shaking his head and desperately objecting to something. The 2 deputies walked out the front door of the church, and Mr. DeStaro sagged against Killian Cleary, who sat him down in a nearby chair. Something was happening. Call Kimber now, Kyle said. I tried again, and this time the call rang twice and was sent to voicemail. I ended the call and threw my hands up, looking desperately at Kyle. Again, he said, and took out his own phone. I got the same result, but felt a jolt of relief when somebody answered Kyle's call. But it wasn't Kimber. Phil, what part of town are you in? I need a ride. It's an emergency. I waited. Yeah, man, I'm at Northridge Church. As fast as you can. I'm with Sam. I'll owe you. Kyle hung up and then immediately tried Kimber's phone. She's sending me to voicemail too. We both stood at the window, anxiously waiting to see Phil Saunders' silver Mazda pull up. Kyle chewed his lip and I tapped my phone. Come on, Saunders. We threw occasional looks back at Kimber's dad until Cleary stood him up and ushered the now inconsolable man out of the church. Suddenly, Kyle's phone chirped and we both looked down to see Kimber's name flash up on the screen. Kyle's knees nearly buckled in relief and he sagged against the wall. She said, I found it. Kyle opened the text and furiously typed a response. They're coming for you, Kay. We both stared at the phone, waiting for a response, and just as the sun blinded us as it reflected off of Phil's approaching silver sedan, we got one. They're here. It was the last message we ever got from Kimber. When Phil dropped us at the DeStaro house, we found the front door unlocked and no one home. My car was sitting in the driveway, unlocked with the keys in the ignition and the engine running. Kyle and I drove back to the church. But the funeral was over, and the few people that had attended it were already gone. We drove back to Kimber's house again, but it was just as we'd left it, and no one was home. Kyle had lost it by this time and was an absolute wreck. He'd called her so many times I was sure he'd worn out her phone's battery. His calls went straight to voicemail now, and his texts were unread. After a half hour of begging from Kyle, I finally called my dad. He answered immediately. Sammy, what's wrong? It's Kimber. Dad, she's gone. We looked everywhere, but her and her dad are just fucking missing. She left the funeral early and Killian Cleary was talking to her dad and then Simpson and Grigg left and I think they went to her house and they got her. Dad, they got her. They're all working for Cleary on the side or something and I think they're doing something bad. Whoa. Slow down, Sam. Come by the station and let's talk. I'll take a statement from you boys. And I'll send a couple of officers down to investigate the house right now. Just calm down. We'll handle this. I hung up and threw my car violently into reverse, jerking the wheel to the left as I hit the end of the driveway. Sam, How do you know? How do you know we can trust the cops? It's okay, Kyle. I'm not trusting the cops. I'm trusting my dad, I said, my words sounding hopeless even to me. I turned into the sheriff's office, and Kyle was out of the car as soon as I slowed down enough to park. By the time I got inside, my dad had Kyle by the shoulders and was nodding solemnly at everything he was telling him. When my dad saw me, he motioned for another officer to take us to his office. After a few minutes, he came in and sat down across from us. All right, boys. In a few minutes, I'm going to have Officer Ramirez come in and take a statement from you both. I want you to know that at this time, it looks like the Destaros left town voluntarily. No way, Mr. Walker. Kimber would never... My dad held up his hand for silence. Let me rephrase. Jacob Destaro left town voluntarily. Kimber is still a minor and has no legal rights here. If her dad said they're leaving, then they're leaving. But she's not answering her phone, and we went to her house. Dad, nothing was packed. Maybe they're just going for a while. Maybe going to her relatives. I can't theorize as to why she wouldn't answer her phone, other than maybe she wants to be left alone for a while. Kyle was exasperated. But, look, I know it's hard for you to understand, but losing a family member takes a toll on a person. Sam, you know that. We don't know how people are going to grieve, and we don't have any right to. I think it's very likely that Kimber will be back by the fall for school. By the fall? It's Sheriff Walker, that's 2 months away. You need to start investigating now. Kyle, I know you're upset, and no one said we're not going to investigate thoroughly. Like you investigated Whitney's disappearance thoroughly. I spat, and I didn't regret the words. Sam! He snapped with more force than I'd ever heard him use. I am tired of you constantly trying to insinuate that I didn't do everything in my power to find Whitney. I loved your sister more than you can imagine. She's your sister, but she's my daughter. I will never give her up. And what about the deputies that left the funeral to go after her? Kyle interrupted. My dad raised an eyebrow at me. Sampson and Greg, I blurted out through clenched teeth. He sighed. Boys, Sampson and Greg left the funeral because I sent them on a call. I stood up violently, knocking over my chair in the process. Oh, come on, Dad! All right, that's enough! The sheriff slammed his hands on the desk and stood up. I told you I would tell you what I know. And I have. I understand your friend is important to you, and god damn it, the Destaros are my friends. I promise you that I will use the full extent of my power to track them down and put your minds at ease. But until then, all I can offer you is the assurance that there is no sign of foul play at this time. You boys need to get off the warpath and let us handle this. Now, Ramirez is waiting in the hall to take your statements. And then both of you are going home. Understand? I said nothing and glared at my dad, seething with rage. Kyle stood up and walked out of the room with no emotion whatsoever. He walked past Ramirez, and I followed him out to the car. We got in, and I waited for Kyle to say something. I heard a loud sniffle and looked over at him to see his face slick with tears. It was the first time I'd ever seen Kyle cry. But it wouldn't be the last. He's lying, he whispered. Kyle turned his face away from me. I know he's lying. Something bad has happened and he's lying about it. What happened? I heard more sniffling as Kyle tried to collect himself. Dude, fucking talk to me. What do you think happened? Kimber's gone, like all the others. So, she's at the place where bad things happen. I punched the steering wheel. How the fuck had this happened? Not Kimber, please, fuck, not Kimber. Was all of this because of me? Had her mother killed herself because of something I had done? Something we'd found out? Was Kimber taken because of me? If I thought for 1 minute that was true, I knew I'd crack into a million pieces. No. Not Kimber. No. Yes, Sam. Fucking think about it. Kyle yelled at me. It's the treehouse. It's all the same. Borasca, the Skinmen, the Triple Tree, your sister, the mountain. It's all the fucking same. It's the Prescott Empire. And Kimber has been fucking consumed by it. Where do we go? I could feel the warm tears of my own desperation and helplessness sliding down my cheeks. What do we do? What do we fucking do? Kyle threw his hands up in frustration. We have to go to Ambercott, right? It all starts and ends at the Triple Tree. Surely you figured that out. But we've been to the treehouse 1,000,000 times, Kyle. There's nothing there. Well, I don't know what the fuck else you want me to do, Sam. There was a rap, rap, rap. And I jumped as someone tapped on the window of the car. I wiped the tears off my face and rolled down the window to see Officer Grigg leaned down and looked in the car. You boys move along, all right? Yep, I said, and turned the key in the ignition. Officer Grigg waved at us as we pulled out of the parking lot, but we didn't wave back. The treehouse, Kyle said. We drove in silence, both of us trying desperately to get a hold of ourselves. If we were going to be of any help to Kimber, we needed to be calm enough to think logically. I parked in the space next to the trailhead and saw several bikes had been tied to the post. As we made our way up the West Rim Prescott Ore Trail, we passed Parker and a couple of his friends coming down it. I nodded to him, but Kyle said nothing and just stared up the trail, reaching for the only place he knew to go. It was almost dark by the time we got to Ambercott Fort, and there was little light left to search for whatever it was that Kyle hoped to find. It took half an hour in the darkness before I finally convinced him that there was nothing here that could help Kimber. And though we didn't speak of it, I knew that he and I were both painfully aware of all the sounds of the night. We were scared, terrified down to our very bones, though we would hear the one sound that we didn't want to hear. The piercing, scraping, grinding metal screams of the monster at Borasca, we had become so accustomed to over our childhood. We both dreaded it, prayed it would not come, and we did not speak of it. I dropped Kyle at home and promised we would find Kimber tomorrow. I swore we would. But he gave me nothing more than a shallow nod and disappeared inside his house. My dad was waiting for me in the kitchen when I got home, a few minutes later. I didn't look at him and walked over to the fridge, realizing I hadn't eaten all day. Sam, I want you to sit down. I want to apologize for today. I took out some chicken and cheese and went to the pantry for bread. I know you're scared, and I know that a lot has been going on that you can't exactly relate to, he sighed. And I've been depressed for a very long while. Sam, over 20 years. That'll weigh on a person. I ignored him and continued making my sandwich. I was dying inside, wondering if I would even trust the man I'd called Dad my entire life. She was suffering, Sam. And sometimes people who suffer that deeply, they don't have any other way out. At least that's what they think. She knew her depression was hurting her husband and her daughter, and maybe she mistakenly thought that she was doing them a favor. Mum's depressed, I said, without taking my eyes from my task. He sighed. Your mother is coping okay. This was very different, Sam. Kimber's mum has been depressed since she was in her 20s, early in her marriage, and suffered multiple miscarriages. Infertility can be so hard on couples, and not even Kimber's birth could really ease that kind of pain. Dad, with all due respect, I'm tired, and I'm going to bed. Carl and I are getting up early to look for Kimber. I threw the knife in the sink with a loud clang and turned to look at my dad for the first time. Just please tell me you're actually trying to find Kimber. The sheriff stood up from the kitchen table, looking as tired and dishevelled as I felt. I promise, Sammy. And finally, I believed him. The next morning when I pulled up to Kyle's house, Parker came out to meet me. Hey, Parker, I said when I rolled down the window and cool morning wafted in. Kyle's not here. He left around 5. Stole my dad's truck. He's pissed, so you'd better go. Thanks, man, I said, and then rolled up the window and took off down the street. I drove around all morning looking for Kyle and calling his cell, but he didn't pick up until around noon. Sorry, man, I couldn't sleep. Kyle sounded a bit more stable than yesterday. That's cool. Where are you at? A rest spot where I'm getting service. What, are you in the woods? Yeah. She's out here, Sam. Somewhere. In these mountains. I can feel it. I know it. All right. Well, okay, just come down to the West Rim Trail and I'll meet you there. I was only 5 minutes away, so I arrived before Kyle had time to get down the mountain. Mr. Landy's red Dodge Ram was parked haphazardly in a no parking zone, and I figured it would probably be towed by the time we got back. I doubted Kyle cared at this point, though. I crossed my arms and leaned against my car as I waited for him, staring up at the dirty red trail in impatience. When Kyle finally showed half an hour later, he was covered in sweat and dirt and dejection. So? I said, pushing up off the car. No, nothing, man. All right, well, let's keep searching. We hiked miles and miles of the mountain that day, but we didn't find any sign of human life. And for the next few days, if the sun was out, so were we. But Kyle was growing more and more desperate, crossing onto private property to look for logging equipment and mapping out the county's many mines to search the abandoned buildings. But the mountain was big. The needle was buried deep in the haystack. And as the days slipped away, so did Kyle's sanity. Every time I saw my dad, he would give me a sober look and promise that they were still looking for Kimber. but it seemed to me that he was growing concerned. That a Starro house remained as cold and as empty as the space between the stars above it. It was on the 11th night of our Kimberless existence that I was awoken out of a troubled sleep by the piercing, whirling, screeching sound of death at Borasca. I cried myself back to sleep, to the tortured sounds of Kyle's own agony next door. We'd failed her. Kimber was dead. Before I head off today, I want to give an absolutely massive thank you to my beautiful, glorious patrons, Lady Nevermore, Skulk Queen, Catherine Gordon, The Curator, and Stephen Stevens.